In the summer of 1965, Sylvia's parents, carnival workers by profession, traveled with the carnival circuit. With little money and no permanent home, they needed someone responsible to care for their two daughters while they were on the road. They found someone who seemed trustworthy, a woman named Gertrude Banaszewski, living in Indianapolis, Indiana. Gertrude and her husband lived in a modest house on Belmont Avenue. They had several children and lived in a neighborhood where people knew one another. At first, Gertrude agreed to care for both Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny. For a little money and their parents' promise to take care of them, the girls moved in. But what began as a temporary arrangement would soon descend into something far more sinister. At first, Sylvia and her sister Jenny tried to fit in. They did chores, helped around the house, and kept to themselves. But inside the walls of the Banaszewski home, something dark was beginning to take root. Sylvia's quiet nature was misunderstood as defiance. She was frequently punished for the smallest things, a misplaced dish, a forgotten chore, punishments that seemed to grow harsher with each passing day. Neighbors later told investigators that they occasionally heard raised voices and commotion from behind the Banaszewski house. But nothing could prepare anyone for what would happen in the coming weeks. The abuse that Sylvia endured was not just physical punishment anymore. It became psychological terror and intentional cruelty. Over the next 3 months, Sylvia's life became a nightmare. Gertrude Banaszewski's own children began to participate in the abuse. But that was not all. Neighborhood youths, sometimes encouraged by Banaszewski herself, joined in. Many of them were teenagers, young people who should have known better. They beat her, humiliated her, and inflicted pain with disturbing creativity. Sylvia was systematically starved. She was beaten so badly that she could hardly walk. Her head was burned, her body bruised beyond recognition, and her clothing was often cut or torn. The routines of school, friends, and childhood joy became nothing but a distant memory. Her younger sister Jenny, frightened and powerless, was often forced to watch. As the weeks dragged on, Sylvia's condition deteriorated. Her body was marked with hundreds of wounds. Her face, arms, legs, and torso showed evidence of repeated beatings, burns, and lacerations. Some wounds were inflicted with literal tools, knives, cigarette burns, and other objects used by her tormentors. No matter how weak Sylvia became, the attacks never stopped. What made this case so shocking is that neighbors weren't completely unaware. Some heard screams. Some saw Sylvia in a frail, fading state. But nearly everyone justified it as discipline, the idea that Gertrude, as a caregiver or mother figure, had the right to punish the children however she saw fit. That mistaken belief effectively hid the horror unfolding right on their street. By October 1965, Sylvia was barely recognizable. Her flesh bore more than 150 wounds. She was a shadow of the vibrant teen who had arrived at the Banaszewski home months before. On October 26, 1965, she succumbed to her injuries. The official cause of death recorded by the coroner was a combination of subdural hematoma, shock, and severe malnutrition. In short, she died because no one intervened before it was too late. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a simple case of discipline gone wrong. This was sustained torture, carried out by adults and teenagers over a period of time, that ended in death. Once word of Sylvia's death reached law enforcement, authorities began piecing together the horrifying story. Statements from neighbors, witnesses, and surviving victim Jenny uncovered layers of abuse so extreme that they stunned investigators. Law enforcement quickly realized this was more than neglect. It was an intentional, repeated campaign of cruelty. Gertrude Banaszewski, along with some of her children and several neighborhood youths, collectively responsible for the assaults, were arrested and charged in connection with Sylvia's death. In May 1966, they were brought to trial. At trial, prosecutors described the case as the most diabolical case to ever come before a court in Indiana. They detailed the months of abuse, the grotesque injuries, and the psychological trauma inflicted upon Sylvia. Deputy Prosecutor Leroy New explained that Sylvia had been subjected to degradation that was beyond anything one would expect, even in the worst acts of cruelty. Gertrude Banaszewski's defense tried to argue that she was overwhelmed by financial stress, chaos in her household, and that any punishments were misguided attempts at discipline. But the evidence was overwhelming. Photos, medical reports, and eyewitness testimony painted a picture of intentional and brutal torture. In the end, Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder. She received life imprisonment. Several of her children and teenage perpetrators were convicted of lesser charges, including manslaughter and neglect. Some received sentences in juvenile detention or shorter prison terms. The murder of Sylvia Likens became a watershed moment in American true crime history. It forced communities and authorities to rethink how society views child abuse, parental authority, and the danger of turning a blind eye when warning signs are visible. In the decades that followed, journalists, authors, and filmmakers revisited the case. Sylvia's story has been referenced in books and documentaries, each one aiming to highlight not only what happened, but why no one stopped it earlier. The question, could someone have saved her, echoes even today. For many, Sylvia's name became a symbol of how cruelty can hide in plain sight, and how communities must be vigilant in protecting the vulnerable. Although Sylvia's murder took place in 1965, the lessons it taught are still relevant. Abuse doesn't always happen behind locked doors. Sometimes it happens in neighborhoods where neighbors hear screams but rationalize them away. Sometimes it happens where people assume someone else will step in. Sometimes the pain becomes normalized until it's too late. And for those of us telling these stories, whether journalists, documentarians, or YouTubers, Sylvia's story serves as a reminder. Real crime isn't just about suspects and verdicts. It's about the human lives behind the headlines and the ways in which ordinary people can be failed by those who should have protected them. Sylvia Likens did not die in a strange alley. She was not the victim of a single moment of violence. She died after months of systematic abuse, humiliation, torture, and intentional harm that no one stopped. Her story remains one of the most haunting true crime cases in American history, a tragic reminder that silence and inaction can be just as harmful as the crimes themselves.